Okay, I'm reporting live from my Airbnb in Greece. I've never vlogged before, but basically, I'm working on my qualifying exam for my PhD, which is like this fucked up hazing ritual where I have to read like 100 books and then break them off into subsections and then sub-subsections and then read those subsections together so that I can like prove that I can conduct research in my field. So this is the first of a series of video essays of me running through the concepts of my sublists. I have to like write longer, like 40-minute to an hour presentations, but this is kind of just an exercise to see if I can like get it down fast. So this presentation is called Black, White, and Red All Over, Origins of Property, Primitive Accumulation, and Enclosure. And my kind of main question is how property emerges through dispossession. And basically, I'm going to read through 6 texts that engage with this idea and then kind of tell a story of like where this like lineage of knowledge of primitive accumulation came from, critiques, where it's going, current debates. So, part one is going over Karl Marx's chapter on so-called primitive accumulation in volume one of Capital, Das Kapital. And then part two is 3 works, two from 1983, that are really on like race construction um, in the US and how that like impacted the story of primitive accumulation, right? So like if we think of like primitive accumulation as like the OG story, these are sort of like the later additions, the remix. Um, and then the third one in that section is a feminist critique. So we have Marx, and then we have 2 people talking about race like 200 years later, and then someone like 30 years later after that being like also women. And then the last two are like what I'm calling enduring debates. And it's just kind of like more contemporary ideas that engage with like all the literature and like kind of where the conversation is going now. So, part one. And you can follow along on the lecture notes. So, part one, ursprüngliche Accumulation, or so-called primitive accumulation in the origins of dispossession. This is the Marx. So before I even get into it, I want to talk about primitive accumulation like as an idea. So obviously, maybe not obvious to everybody, Capital, Das Kapital is originally written in German, and so it's been translated. And like overall, all the ideas have made it across, but there are like some kind of like sticky moments in translation that I think can be confusing if you don't have a background in Marxist political theory. And I know for me, it was like very confusing and hard at first. So, primitive here does not denote the like proto-indigenous, like sort of like racially coded word that we usually use in English. Like, it's pretty rare that we use primitive for anything, and also it's derogatory. In German, the word ur actually just means like original, primordial, very old, in the beginning. And then Ursprung means like just like the first, the beginning. So you can think of it as the original sin of capitalism, which Marx does. And like he kind of makes that like biblical connection throughout it. So primitive accumulation, or the original sin of capitalism, is basically the story of what separated the worker from the laborer, sorry, the worker or laborer from the means of production. So he starts in feudal England and then sort of traces how England went from feudal England to capitalism, how it works today. And he uses England as like a polemic. It's like a case study example of this is, how we go to capitalism 101. But it's not the only example. Um, but it's really powerful to use narrative as a pedagogical tool. You can reach more people. It's very humanizing. Like there's a reason why you do it. And all of Das Kapital doesn't actually work like that. Like a lot of it is sort of like the more like heavy, dry, like definitions and like sort of like philosophy, like critique, like reads like econ. But this part doesn't. So we start in feudal England. So feudal England, this is like pre-medieval. Like we've got at the top of their social hierarchy, it's the monarch, the king. He's the boss. Everything pretty much technically in feudal Europe um, belonged to the king. All the land is like it's all the king shit. Okay, under the king we have the lords, and these were like sort of like like, and I don't know, I think this is also like pretty like common knowledge, people know this, but the lords are like the next step down. Um, Under the lords, knights, sometimes the lords would kick them down some land. They like had like a little bit more respect, like they obviously were like the soldiers, whatever. And then at the very bottom, there's the serfs. They're the farmers, the shepherds, they steward the land. So if we like think about it, sort of like in context to the land, the closer you are to the land, the more of your peers there are and the broker you are. So like there's lots of serfs and they're all tending to the land and none of them really have any money. But it doesn't really matter because you don't have to work for money yet. Like you have a sheep, you herd the sheep, you eat the sheep. Like there's not like we're not at this like exchange of money yet for capitalism. Okay. So no one possesses absolute or exclusive ownership, and like the land has overlapping rights. So like this idea of like common land. So like technically, yeah, it's all the kings, but like the Lord has like their spot, and like maybe you're on the Lord's land, and like there is like obviously still a hierarchy, but it doesn't exist the same way that like we think of it now, where like there's like the landlord and like this is mine and it belongs to me, and this like that's the idea of enclosure pretty much. So in comes enclosure, or kind of this idea of like private land property. And so when enclosure comes in, villagers pretty much lose their rights to this land that they've been tending for centuries and they become free laborers. Okay, notes on this. So, like, one thing I want to point out is that enclosure wasn't just like a natural thing that happened. There's this primitive accumulation, the chapter's called so-called primitive accumulation, because there was this sort of like myth that was being sold by like the Adam Smith Wealth of Nations that like people just like made money and then pulled themselves up and like that's capitalism just happened naturally and that's not what happened, right? They enforced enclosure, right, in this idea, and then people lost the land, like lost access to the land that they'd been on, and they became the free laborer. This is another translation thing where like free doesn't mean like the unpaid laborer, like you're not working for free. It's kind of the opposite, actually. Free means you are free to work for money wherever you want, wherever you want. Um, so the like free labor is free to sell their labor power for money to live. And now the like the peasant, the serf who, didn't necessarily need to work to live the same way they do. Now they do. Now you have to be this free laborer if you want anything. So that's sort of like the like short version, Spark Notes, primitive accumulation. And his main point in the end is that the capitalist economic system needed a workforce separated from the means of subsistence because workers needed to enter the market and sell their labor. So like capitalism couldn't happen and wouldn't work if people didn't need to work to live. Like you have to set that up, and like he's been pointing out that like that's not like a like natural thing that just occurred. Okay, part two. What's my point? Oh yeah, Marx. Capitalist private property emerged through class division, expropriation, and control. That's our lesson in part one. Okay, part two. We're jumping forward 200 years, 250 years. It's 1983. So these three texts that I'm about to read, two of them published in 1983, this section is called Interventions and Complications Through Race and Gender Theory. So they're basically re-invoking Marx' story of primitive accumulation, which is very easy to talk about, right? Because he writes it as narrative. So you can insert more narrative. So it lends itself well to history and talking about history. So the first one comes out of the Black radical tradition. Cedric Robinson, this Black radical political theorist, and he is an academic, and it is an academic book. He writes this book, Black Marxism, very on the nose. Um, Pretty much just reads Marx, the Black radical tradition, um, and he similarly it's a dense read, right? Like he goes back through this like Proto-European like history, telling, but like inserting the concept of race. And like his main contention was that like race didn't happen after capitalism. Like it's not like capitalism happened in the story of primitive accumulation, and they were like, oh, now we need race to keep capitalism going. His argument was that actually you already had race going. Like the practice of subjugating people is like proto-racism. Like you were already creating those divides. Like when you start to decide who like deserves like to live and like have money and like whatever, like you're inventing racism, and that racism and capitalism sort of like grew together. That's his main point. The controversy here and like critiques from other like Black theorists is, and it's also true, like Marx does engage with the socioeconomic consequences of chattel slavery throughout Das Kapital, like fairly extensively. And like some say, and I'm, inclined to agree that like this intervention is dogmatic and like kind of a little bit of like a trying to be a little bit of a gotcha, but it's important nonetheless and is sort of like the first like big text that we have talking about sort of like Blackness and Marxism in this like academic context. We love Cedric Robinson. Okay, next, Jay Sakai. This is an alias for this political activist who is apparently Japanese American, but like we can't confirm or deny because it's an alias. Um, so he comes out with this book that's like with this like DIY indie press called Settlers, The Mythology of the White Proletariat. Um, since the original book is maybe 200 pages, and is very like it's like a very approachable read. Like it's not as dense as Black Marxism is. Um, and since then, there have been like six, seven, eight different editions where he's like gone back and edited and read them. And like for the purposes of this, like I'm just focusing on the OG release in 1983. So this work, it's polemic. It's not academic. So it doesn't have the same like peer reviewing that a book like Robinson's book had. But it is considerably more accessible. It's easier to read. It's shorter, and does have like a very, very compelling argument in it that I think is really interesting. So, um, his point is basically he takes it back to the US like very explicitly. And he's like, what does he say? He's like, okay, so the Europeans who were coming over to the US, right? The like lower middle class Europeans who are coming over to the US during the colonial era are one, not the proletariat. Okay, which is like an interesting and hot take, but like they're not the proletariat. And the reason they're coming is because they want land. Why? Because they're seeing in Europe post-feudalism, as capitalism is progressing, oh, land equals power. I have land, I get power. There is an off chance that maybe I could go to the West and get land and then I will have power, right? So it's this like land grab like desire, which is why he argues that it's like considerably closer to like a petite bourgeoisie than it is to like a proletariat. And like proletariat, the laborers, the working force, like, and then like the petite bourgeoisie are like kind of like the middle class. Um, and it's important that to note that like his whole point pretty much like he goes through like a bunch of different cases, but like his bottom line is that over and over and over again we just see that like the point of all of this is land. It's land grabbing. Um, and so like the indentured servants in Europe, right? Like, they work for a time, work their debt off, come over to the US, and then they steal the land from indigenous people. And then there were like all these like enslaved people there who were working, and they were like building up most of the workforce, which also made the white people like not the proletariat because they weren't fucking working. And then it also made the like enslaved people not proletariat because they weren't being paid. So it was this like weird like sort of like class skipping that was happening and it was like continued to be reinforced because as long as you like kept that divide, people wouldn't revolt. So like one example he uses is like he says that New York is a land that was Manhattan is a land that was stolen twice, right? Like originally it was stolen from the indigenous people there. And then there were like a bunch of enslaved Africans there who were working, but like so many that like, and this is during like the Dutch colonial era there were so many that the Dutch were like, we need to start paying them or they're like gonna mutiny and it's like not gonna be good for us. And so they start giving them a little bit of land and then the English take over and they're like, oh, absolutely not. And they need to like double down on like this like class and like race discrimination thing. So they take away the land from the like African people who were there in New York. So stolen, stolen again. Then, obviously Revolutionary War. So like it's sort of this like constant iteration. Then he also brings in the West Coast and like what was going on over there and how like he mentions or he talks about how like there was a difference in treatment between like the Chinese immigrants and then who were working and then the indigenous population. Like the main focus, like the rhetorical goal of like the colonialism in the West was this land grab, right? Like they weren't trying to get indigenous labor. They didn't really give a fuck about that. They were trying to get their land and assimilate them because there were like too many of them. They knew the land better, like to and like it was just way too hard to control those people. Whereas like the Chinese immigrants who were coming in, it was way there were fewer of them, they were a minority. It's way easier to just like use them for the labor. So like both parties are being extracted from, um, but in different ways. This comes up later. Okay, so that's the Sakai pretty much. Finally, so we have these like two racial reads in the 80s. 2004, Silvia Federici, Italian feminist, legend. We love her. Everybody should read Wages Against Housework. Great essay. Um, she comes in and she's like, what about the bitches? What about the girls? What's going on? And so she writes this book, Caliban and the Witch, Women, the Body, and Primitive Accumulation. And so her like main issue was that like she felt like there was a sort of like gap in theory, or like sort of like intellectual niche in feminist theory that wasn't being answered by like the radical feminists and it wasn't being answered by the socialist feminists. So she writes this book, Caliban and the Witch, which is a reference to The Tempest, the Shakespeare play, which basically Caliban is this like indigenous woman who lives on this island, and then like the Tempest boat crashes there, and she's like sort of painted as this bad guy, but like it was her land from the jump, and like there were later versions of it where people like sort of invoke Caliban or the Tempest. Aimé Césaire rewrote the Tempest, La Tempête. From this like decolonized perspective. Anyway, so that's the reference, Caliban and the Witch. And she also talks about the witch hunt. And she pretty much is like, okay, going back to Marx, primitive accumulation, step one. Yes, 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 yes. But asterisk, um, the evolution of capitalism was also predicated on the construction of a new patriarchal order, which was based on the exclusion of social reproduction from wage work. Okay, that's a lot. I just read the sentence off the page because it's a lot to jump into. So pretty much if we cut to um, this like transition from feudalism to capitalism, now that we have this need for a waged labor force for these free laborers, we need free laborers. And the way to get free laborers is social reproduction. So social reproduction is like the reproduction of society. So everything that needs to go down to make sure that you get your ass to work. Where like having a house, eating, having children, like a family, the like emotional support, like everything that has now been gendered as like feminine labor. She's saying, A, this fucking happened because they needed somebody to do it. Like they needed to make sure that somebody was there working, doing the social reproduction to make the labor force, and conveniently are written out of the equation altogether. And so it's this sort of like unwaged work that's like super under theorized for like centuries. Um, yeah, so workers are kicked off the land. Now we need women at home to keep the workforce going. And now women are also incredibly reliant on men. And then she talks about kind of how like a lot of like power was taken from women and like knowledge about our bodies and stuff. Like it's a big whole feminist thing. I'm not going to get into it, but she's like, what about the girls? If we beat the boys, who gonna be the girls? Sylvia Federici gonna be the girls. Primitive accumulation is what Marx said, and also primitive accumulation is about disciplining women, sexuality, and reproduction. Okay. Overall, we have Robinson, Federici, Sakai, and they all agree pretty much. Capitalism never depended exclusively on free wage labor. It organized different populations through differentiated relations to wages, property, coercion, and reproduction. Part three. Enduring debates on primitive accumulation, neoliberalism, and materiality. Okay, so these two texts are the more contemporary ones. The first one's from 2014, it's a book, and the next one is from 2024, and it is an article in a journal. So, first one, Red Skin, White Mass, Rejecting the Colonial Politics of Recognition. This is by Glenn Sean Coulthard, um, and is pretty much he's taking a from a Canadian Indigenous perspective, talking about like Canada's post-colonial attempts to reconcile its relationship with Indigenous peoples, like through recognition, land claims, rights, and limited forms of self-government. So the important things he does in this is like he IDs the difference between recognition and material reality. There is a whole field of research called materialism, which is very related to Marxism, and new materialism and all of that. But like the short of it is materialism is like exactly what you think. Like it's the material reality of like what the hell is going on. So um basically Cold is like it doesn't matter if you have a land acknowledgement if you're not doing anything. Like, you know, like who the fuck cares? Like recognition is not enough. Like we need material change. Um, groundbreaking, you know? So, like he says, the colonizer is more invested in the seizure of indigenous lands than in the labor of indigenous peoples. This is important. This is kind of what Sakai was saying before. Like when we think about the like what was going on in California and the Pacific Northwest with like the indigenous people, the colonizers, and the Chinese people who were all coming in and like what like the different dynamics was. Like his point was that like they didn't care about this indigenous labor, they needed the indigenous land. That was what was important. And so so long as the colonial project still has the land, then it like doesn't matter how much recognition or whatever, because like at like, you know, bottom line, you know, we still like you still have the land. Like that's the whole point. Um, and it's just like a distraction to placate people. Um, and it's also not historical, right? Like it's live, like it's happening real currently right now. Um, he encourages self-recognition via grounded normativity. That's kind of like the theory that he coins in this, which is ethical and political systems produced through indigenous land-based practices. Land back, basically, pretty much. So his like main point is recognition without the material return of land, therefore leaves the colonial relation fundamentally intact. Like it's the same shit. Kind of similar to like, you know, Master's Tools, if you've ever read Audre Lorde. Okay. Number six, last one. It's called Theorizing Racial slash Colonial Primitive Accumulation, Settler Colonialism, Slavery, and Racial Capitalism. Mouthful. It's from the journal Race and Class by Siddhant Isser. Okay, so this takes the conversation around primitive accumulation even further, and this is the one from 2024, by thinking about its ongoing reality under neoliberalism and how that reality is structured by the same forms of racial and colonial domination which capitalism was built. Okay, mouthful. First of all, um, neoliberalism is generally this idea that um, it's basically like the driving force behind like the like continued privatization of property. So like in this essay, he does like a really good job of kind of like going from like 2000, maybe like 90s arguments about primitive accumulation, like running the greatest hits and sort of talking about what they got right, what they got wrong. Um, beyond Marx's original account, and then yeah, he points to what's missing. So capitalism continues to depend on wage labor exploitation alongside extra economic forms of expropriation, coercion, and dispossession. His main point, okay, I forgot to mention neoliberalism. No, it's that neoliberalism is the privatization, um, increased privatization. It's the idea that like you can just, as long as you're like accumulating capital, there's this excess, and you can just like keep buying shit, and then like the lower class, like they just like figure themselves out. Like you're free to. It's free in the same sense that like the free laborer. So he points out that like and a big yeah, this is like a big part of like primitive accumulation theory because it's kind of a part of the story. It's sort of like what happens next, like what is like the progression, right? Okay. So his whole point is that the working theories are they're too functionalist. So if we think of like functionalism as like the antithesis to materialism, so like it's the theory, it's the like they're talking about it, but like nobody's like talking about like boots on the ground, like what is going on. Okay. The current combo fails to acknowledge the productive power of white supremacists. And his whole boots on the ground point is like racism, right? So again, he employs narrative as he builds out his argument, and he talks about the cotton gin in the US. Um, basically, he says that like after the let me just read it because he lays it out very well. Quote, the main factors driving the meteoric growth in cotton production in the U.S. were continental territorial expansion, including the forced removal of indigenous populations inhabiting these lands, massive increase in the demand of use of slave labor on the newly acquired and emptied lands, and the extension of northern and international credit lines to southern planters. Okay, so he uses the cotton gin and like this like crazy massive increase in like cotton production post cotton gin, and he attributes it to like these three main things. And his whole point is that like it's not it's not just racism. Like it wasn't just the like it's faster to make cotton. It was that, and also we stole more land from the indigenous people, and also we have more slaves, and also we have more credit, and like there's more capital in the system. So he sort of like breaks down the like working theory of like neoliberalism and primitive accumulation into these like three camps. And his whole point is that like you can't just like make like stretch all of the he uses the term stretch all of the primitive accumulation theory to just like talk about everyone. Like you need to specify how different populations and like are affected, of different races are affected differently through this practice. And it's all bad, but it's not the same. So it's again similar to like what Sakai was saying, where it's like the everyone is being expropriated from, but it's not the same for everyone, right? Like we have women who are doing all this like social reproductive labor and they're not being paid. And then we also have Black people in the prison industrial complex and like how that's going down. And then we also have the concept, the myth of a model minority. And so he like his main focus is on like Black and Indigenous people. I'm expanding it right now to talk about the other things that we were talking about. But his whole thing is this sort of fight for specificity in the theory. You need to connect Black, Indigenous, and anti-capitalist struggles without erasing the differences among them. Resistance to racial violence, colonial dispossession, and capitalism can come together to challenge the entire social order. Intersectionalism. Okay, so then to put Coldhart and Isser together, their kind of like main thing is neoliberalism highlights material consequences of primitive accumulation, and we need to talk about race. Boom. Okay, we're back at the end. So, question, how does property emerge from dispossession? Answer, exclusive ownership has to eliminate other people's claims, relationship, and means of survival. It's not only capitalism's origin story. These relations are continually reproduced through privatization of debt, incarceration, and the ongoing occupation of indigenous land, and the unequal organization of productive and reproductive labor. It all goes hand in hand, and that is my lecture on social reproduction. No, on, what's this lecture on? Primitive accumulation.